Thank you, Dr. Blaine. Data as the great equalizer. I love that. And that's a perfect foundation for our next session. Hi, everyone. I'm Heidi Lawrenson, Senior Vice President of Marketing here at Excella, and it's great to be with you all again. I'm particularly moved by your stories, not only of resilience, but also of leveraging the opportunity of dramatic change to set a new bar for what great governance looks like and the right IT strategies to support it. One of the new bars that our nation and much of the world, in fact, has been thrust into resetting and, in fact, raising is how to create more equitable communities. Economic equity, health equity, gender equity, digital equity, racial equity, and more. The pandemic and its disproportionate impact on some communities has amplified this focus. We've been thinking a lot about this at Excella because we see the value of equity both within our own organization. For example, we have a new employee group focused on DE&I, and most especially, though, the importance of equity to our customers. Our customer-facing staff are increasingly hearing it as a priority. And that's why this group is here, to take a big goal like equity and make it actionable, especially with the use of data that governments already have or can get access to. So we've gathered experts who are working to help make equity a reality in cities, counties, and states. And based on discussions this group has had in preparation for this panel, I'm confident it's going to prove extremely useful in helping you chart your own path forward to better leveraging data for equitable outcomes in your communities. Joining me today are Dr. Robert Blaine. As you know from his keynote just now, he's the Senior Executive and Director for National League of Cities YEF Institute, which empowers municipal leaders across America to take bold actions to better outcomes and greater equity for all children, youth, and families in their communities. He's a practitioner too. Dr. Blaine served as the City of Jackson's Chief Administrative Officer immediately prior to his role at NLC. During his time with Jackson, he led the development and implementation of the city's strategic plan, which promotes a dignity economy, one of my favorite phrases of his, which is an economic model that points municipal investments toward the inherent dignity of every citizen through things like early childhood success, financial empowerment, and equitable workforce development. And next, we have Katya Abazadjian. She's a fellow at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University. And Katya is an open government advocate and researcher working to help cities and states use data for stronger local democracies. Katya's also developed recommendations for state chief data officers to leverage state data for economic recovery from COVID-19. And she helped author the Opportunity Project for Cities, Lessons from St. Paul and San Jose, which has been getting some incredible press lately, and developed a practical toolkit for innovation sprints by local governments that I'm sure you'll want to check out. And our third panelist is Excella's own Vice President of Product Management, Kathy Grossi. Kathy is a senior level manager and data strategist with 20 years experience in product strategy, product management, customer research, and business consulting for enterprise software. She's known for leading teams to conceptualize, research, and implement the launch of new products and services with particular expertise in financial services and, of course, government software solutions. At Excella, Kathy heads up our Data Insights initiative, focused on delivering agency-level insights to our customers, as well as leveraging aggregate data sets to inform government decisions for better community outcomes. And so before we begin, I just want to send out a quick invitation to everyone in the audience to feel free to ask any questions or even share your own experiences and ideas in chat as we go through this panel. Okay, panel, to get us started, and so the audience has a better sense of your point of view on this topic, I'd love for each of you to share a key project you've worked on or are working on that supports improving equity through data. We'll start with Katya.
Great, thanks, Heidi. Yeah, I would love to talk more about the Opportunity Project in City, which, as Heidi said, was an innovation sprint model that we developed and piloted with the cities of San Jose and St. Paul. The model basically requires city governments to find tech partners and community partners who can help them inform the design and development of a new open source tech product that uses city open data. The project model was based on the Federal Opportunity Project, which worked with federal agencies to try to build tools using federal open data. So what we've done is bring this model to the city level, where cities can think about the effect that they're having on residents' everyday lives and involve community partners in designing tools that actually affect and change people's lives. So from that, we published a report, as Heidi mentioned, on the findings in St. Paul and San Jose, which I'm sure will be very interesting to those who want to mirror those projects. But we also developed a toolkit for cities to take on innovation sprints on their own. So we included a lot of tips that we found through running this pilot program. And the toolkit essentially allows people to walk through a 20-week innovation sprint while learning about community-centered design and open data best practices and putting those findings into practice by developing an open source tool that addresses a specific need in the community.
Great. Now you know why she's here. All right. Kathy, I'll go to you next.
Sure. I've been working on an Excella Community Insights project where we're looking at how we can combine building, planning, and zoning data that's collected in everyday processes for agencies, along with their GIS and some demographic data to analyze trends in the community. And through this project, we found that agencies really can use a lot of their data to determine if they're serving their communities equitably. So for example, how many building permit applications are approved or denied in specific areas or across income levels, et cetera. And really looking at if there's discrepancies in the way they're servicing their community. And if there are discrepancies, they could dig deeper to find the causes, such as specific policy or unbalanced resource allocation. And hopefully with this data, agencies can take action to mitigate these discrepancies and create a more equitable environment.
Fantastic. And Dr. Blaine, of course, we just heard from you, but would love to hear your thoughts on this topic specifically.
Sure. So I talked about this a little bit about this in the keynote previously, but the work that we're doing around the American Rescue Plan was really founded in the fact that cities have really strong infrastructure for periods of austerity, right? And when I was a city manager, I knew exactly when I needed to take an anticipatory note if we were going to fall behind in our tax revenue, for example. But there's not a whole lot of infrastructure for large infusions of cash. And we needed to have a data-informed approach to really thinking about how that large amount of money could be invested into communities and invested in a way that was going to transform outcomes. And so, we partnered with the Social Progress Imperative and built a big data tool that would allow for disaggregated data down to the census tract level. So we're currently working in 13 states, really focused on how this data tool can actually align with the priorities that communities have and can create the kinds of information that's needed for a focus on the communities that need the investment the most. And this is really the idea of data as an equalizer. It is a rationale for being able to invest in a way that is focused on community needs, and it moves us away from many conversations that are driven by what I like to call the loudest voice in the room, which are those that have the most access. And so we want to be able to use the data to be able to focus the conversations on the communities that are in greatest need.
Beautiful, thank you. So I'm going to start with a blunt question to each of you. And that is, why is this relevant to our audience? Except for a rare few, they aren't policymakers. They run departments, they lead IT, they're administrators, and others who are helping ensure that governments work. So one reason to care that immediately comes to mind for me is that obviously it underscores the bigger impact of their work, but there's a lot more to it. What would you say?
Well, one of the things that I would say is that the organization of the data is incredibly important. When we start to think about how data is acquired and how it is focused on various communities, it has huge implications on the aspects that that drive the policy side of the work. And it's very easy to to have data governance in a way that can skew what the policy decisions are. And so thinking about the ways that we think of the equity of the data governance, I think is incredibly important, and how data is organized in order to be able to provide that kind of level playing field that then can lead to the kinds of policy decisions that that can provide more equitable outcomes for communities.
Pretty much anyone who has their hand on technology will have a role in that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Katja, I'd love to hear what your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the time innovation efforts happen from the top down, from a leadership level down. But those projects, innovation projects, also have to happen from the bottom up. So as anyone working on the ground will know, just making that connection with a community partner or going out of your way to include a feedback group or creating some kind of opportunity for community members to provide feedback is really an operational shift that has to happen in the day-to-day work of public servants. And so we really do need everyone across departments and across functions to understand how to go out into the community and collect feedback about how data should be used, because that's where you really start to hear what the community needs are, as Dr. Blaine was saying, and incorporate that feedback directly into the design of tech products. So in the Top Cities project, we actually had IT administrators and folks from the tech team that were helping to build the tool, also conducting community interviews with people who are directly affected by chronic homelessness or who are struggling to find rental assistance.
Great. And Kathy, you're close to our customers. Why does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, to build on what Katja was saying, I mean, agencies are really where the rubber hits the road. It's the intersection of the policy, the public agency, and the community. And so the agency is uniquely positioned to really understand the community and feed that information back to policy. I think one thing that's also important, Dr. Blaine talked about the data and making sure the data is structured right, but also that the process to collect the data is structured right as well. You know, we can see if you only collect data online, you're not going to be representative of the whole community, because not all participants in the community interact online, as an example. So I think, you know, what the agency does and collecting the data and how they collect it is very important. And one other thing I would add that Katja touched on is just sharing the data across agencies. So cities and counties can share data with states, and states can share data with federal. And we can see, you know, that kind of snowball effect of how the grassroots data can really affect a broader policy decisions.
Yeah, that's great. That was, you created a perfect lead in to where I'd like to take the conversation next. And that's around the topic of inclusion. And there's a specific example that I recently read about on the roll where data bias has really created some inequity. There was recently a bias hidden in the approval of home loans that's gotten a lot of media attention, and namely lenders were shown to more likely deny home loans to people of color than to white people with similar financial characteristics. So would love your thoughts on how you all think governments can work to address data biases like this and create more inclusion and more equitable outcomes. And are we measuring the right things? And how do we know what those are?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I'll jump in first here. This is a subject that we were dealing with directly in the city of Jackson. One of the, the repercussions that fall down from practices like redlining still have ramifications today. And so one of the projects that we worked on was actually taking the original 1930s redlining map in Jackson, Mississippi, and then correlating that map to disparities in the community. And you could actually see the legacy of those policies and how they've affected communities today, and then tying that to what the practices are today. And so from the city perspective, we wanted to have a conversation with the banking community to really say, this is what we see as the legacy of what we believe is a corrupt policy from the 1930s. And this is how it is impacting communities today. And this is really how we think that we need to reimagine how banking policy is structured so that it creates a fair, a level playing field. And I don't think that Jackson is unique in that situation. I think there are many communities that suffer from this legacy that we've seen in the past. But I think that the number one thing is to be able to identify what the problem is, identify what the root is, be able to demonstrate and show through the data what the impact is on community, and then have a discrete set of remedies that can come in and can actually solve for some of those challenges.
Just to build on that, what Dr. Blaine touched on is really ensuring that at a high level, the communities have defined shared goals and defined outcomes. So if you know the outcome that you want, then looking at the success criteria and determining how to measure that will really help you keep the bias out of the data because you're going at it more systematically. I think that additionally, we need to be innovative about the data collection. We need to do a lot of community outreach to make sure that the data matches the lived experience of people, because a lot of times it doesn't. And so we need to think about how we can bring a community lens to the data and then make sure we structure it and collect it in a equitable way.
Yeah, great. And to that note, Katya, I know you have done work that kind of brings together community data with government data. Maybe talk about that, and obviously anything else that you have to this question.
Yeah, I think both Kathy and Robert kind of touched on a bit of what I was going to say as well. But I think the main idea is that city data can't just be used alone, and I think we obviously have to get out of our comfort zone a little bit and speak to folks who actually understand what the lived experience is, as Kathy said. Also, I think, as to your point, kind of combining community data with city data is a really great way to get folks who understand those legacies and understand the context around how data is collected and what that means about the community to really inform how you're applying the data. So in the Top Cities project, we work directly with service providers and people who work with emergency shelters or frontline workers at emergency shelters to talk to them about how we were going to be using data from their community of care around service availability and combine that with more general information like mapping information and bus routes and programmatic information from the city and county about their funding structures and things like that. So it really requires all these moving pieces, and that's kind of the tough part about data governance. And that's why I think so many cities do fall into the trap of kind of wanting to take a tech product out the door and kind of launch something using this really powerful data, but not realizing that it actually does require building all these relationships and understanding the context around the data and really talking to people who have experience with it and bringing in outside sources to kind of help balance the bias of what the city data might be.
Yeah, it's that classic don't automate something that isn't already have a good process. So that takes us to the concept of access to data. So we just talked about how to ensure there isn't bias built into the data. But even if you have unbiased data, but only some people or some communities have access to it, there's still going to be an uneven playing field.
Yeah, I think one thing I've learned throughout the years of working with city data is that less is more sometimes. I think a lot of cities kind of fall into the fear that, we don't have, the data isn't perfect, it's not complete, or we're still working on it, or what if someone finds an error, and using that as a reason why they don't want to release it. But for example, in San Jose, the project that we did there, building an open source rental assistance finder with the city, was based on really simple information. So the core piece of information that was shared out through that portal is the average amount that someone can expect to receive from a rental assistance program at the city or state, depending on a couple of different characteristics about their family or their household. So that's a really simple piece of information that goes a really long way in helping people figure out whether it's worth their time to apply for rental assistance and wait the amount of time it takes to deliver it. And it's not always that complicated. You don't need to be building like a machine learning algorithm using big data or something. It's like there's really important information that cities have that can be shared out in simple ways that can help people make better decisions. Also, though, I think it's important to recognize that there are limitations to what cities can produce. And a lot of the time that's because of long-term kind of lack of maintenance of the data, for example, or just kind of digging data out for the first time and realizing that, it's been sitting on someone's hard drive for 10 years and we haven't done any quality checks. So that's a very real thing that happens very often. But kind of to everyone else's points and to our conversation about bias, I think that's why we have to incorporate so many quality checks for bias and opportunities to bring others in and gather community feedback to ensure that the data that's getting put out is high quality and trustworthy.
I would just add to what Katja said. I think that she's right on point. When I was with the city of Jackson, we had I built our open data portal. And, one of the challenges that we saw was that, number one, the robustness of the data and how often that data is refreshed is really important, especially if you have an open portal where you're encouraging citizens to be able to use that information. We had challenges when we were looking at, for example, data from the police department. In the ways that the data was collected, the various categories, how it was categorized and the like, and how that could actually skew when you looked, for example, census block by census block across the city. And then the last thing I think is that data has there's an incredible use for data to tell a story and to really bring to life the vibrancy of a community. But if it's not used, so for example, I would have constant conversations with the press about using the actual data as opposed to the anecdotes that they've heard in the community, so that they're actually getting the real picture of what's happening, or at least use the data to be able to back up the anecdotes. And there was often a position that the data actually told a story that might have been a little bit different than what the traditional anecdotes were, and may have pointed us in a different direction. And sometimes there was a unwillingness to actually validate what assertions there may have been in the community with what the data was actually telling us. And so this whole thing about narrative development and what that means, and especially when you're talking about the arc of a narrative that's gone on for a very long time in a community, and being able to see or be able to observe where there might be inflections, where data is moving in a different direction and might point to some changes that are happening in the community that might be really important. So I think that being able to actually actionize that data so that it can actually tell a story is incredibly important also.
Yeah, and I would say one way to actionize, as you say, the data is to, really educate people about the data. It's not good enough to just put data out there and make it accessible. It really has to be user friendly and understandable. So, if we have data that only a handful of data scientists have the tools and the knowledge to access, we're never going to push ourselves to those other narratives that the data is telling us. So, being able to provide tools, education around the data to the broader community allows the community to then draw their own conclusions and start looking at the narrative of the data. So I think that's just an important piece of the accessibility.
Thinking about the arc of a narrative, as you said, Dr. Blaine, and then all the different data sources that Katya touched upon. Data typically is dispersed across various systems. It's a fragmented landscape. And yesterday we saw a video in our yesterday's keynote presentation about Estonia. And another story about Estonia is that when a child is newly born, their registration automatically leads to the provision of childcare benefits, and the data from the tax registry determines how much money should be transferred to which bank account. That clearly is not our norm. How do you see kind of that siloing of data being addressed?
I can take a stab first, but obviously that's a huge question. But I think what I have noticed, is that most people in city government, at least, and also at the federal level, will agree that the need to collaborate around data is really a cultural shift that needs to happen. And there are a lot of obviously technical challenges. There are a lot of social and political challenges to integrating data that comprehensively to the point where kind of registrations trigger benefits and things like that. And there are a lot of state governments working on doing exactly that. But there are still a lot of just cultural barriers to encouraging people to share data openly and to manage our public assets that way. Because what it really is departments that are used to working in their own lanes for a really long time and haven't mentally transitioned from a paper-based system of administration to a digital system where we can actually work together in this way. But we have to really align our values across government departments and agencies and community organizations in order to get to that point, because I think it's still a challenge of getting everyone to buy into the concept of collaborative and cooperative data governance.
This idea of data governance and data sharing agreements, it can be a real challenge. I know that at the beginning of the pandemic, we were, I was running our COVID-19 response team, and we were trying to create a data sharing agreement with the state health department, so that we could get census tract level data about how infections were moving across the city. It took us 4 months to get a data sharing agreement signed, just so that we could start tracking how the pandemic was affecting the community and really being able to micro target how we were providing interventions. That 4 months in the scope of a pandemic is an incredibly long time. And if you think about where we were at the beginning of the year and how quickly things moved, if there had been an infrastructure for us to be able to have those data sharing, or if those data sharing agreements had already been in place, it would have been much easier to be able to build the infrastructure that we needed to be able to manage much better at the beginning of the pandemic. So this idea of integrated systems, not only between, for example, local and state government, but just agencies within the local government, right? I mean, police data and data from the planning department need to be integrated so that we actually understand what's happening in various, when we look at zoning and what that looks like, right? But often those pieces are siloed. And as you said, and to be able to to think about integrating even within the city itself is a challenge. But I think that there are communities that are moving now and are thinking about ways that they can be more resourceful in how they're integrating data across the system and really thinking about what the impact is for the communities and the people that live there. And I think that's the point that we have to focus on. We have to really focus on what that local impact looks like and how it is creating opportunities and communities and what that looks like in the lived experience of the people that live there.
Yeah. And speaking of which, one of the biggest use cases of data is to hold people and organizations accountable, not just in government. And this is how data is used broadly in the private sector as well. But within government, it can play a really critical role in ensuring that all the jurisdictions are held accountable to the improvements and to meet the outcomes. Kathy, I know you're working with a lot of customers at the local level on this. Can you share what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think accountability is a really great point to bring up. And I think, accountability starts with the agency being accountable to the community. And that's sort of the grassroots beginning of accountability. And we're seeing agencies now share more and more data with the community around their service levels and health and safety. And I think this is really great because by sharing this type of data, they're creating a lot of transparency and allowing the community to hold them accountable for doing what they say they're going to do. So for example, building departments can share their average time it takes to complete a plan review, or environmental health departments can publish outcomes of inspections, and citizens can see that data and then really understand, is the agency serving the community? And I think another area of accountability is really important is around environmental justice. So at the local level, agencies are tasked with developing, implementing, or enforcing environmental and public health regulations. And they need to do this in a fair and meaningful way for all people. And I think we can learn a lot from our health inspection data, along with demographic data, to ensure that agencies are enforcing the health regulations equitably within a community and hold them accountable to that. And also to look at areas in the community that have higher risks to address any issues there. So I think, and then this data can be shared, to other agencies such as the Environmental Protection Agency, and they can look at it at a broader level to look at inequities across the country.
Yeah, great. Dr. Blaine or Katja?
Yeah, I think I'll just say one small piece, which I think I previously worked at the Sunlight Foundation, where I helped dozens of cities pass open data policies and get started on kind of the transparency journey. But I think what I learned through that experience was that transparency itself is tough for people. That's hard enough a barrier to get over, but accountability is even harder in a way, because as Kathy was saying, it requires actually listening and being accountable to the community, and then making a shift as a result of that listening. So what I usually use as a metric, and I think the reason why I feel it's so important for IT folks and tech folks to be involved in community-centered design processes around data, is that somebody has to do something with that information that comes from all those feedback sessions, and somebody has to take the initiative to actually change the way the city is doing things as a result of how the data is received by the community, or the data that's received from the community. So I think that's the tough piece that I'm always curious to see how people solve at the local level.
Yeah, and just to add to Katja and Kathy's point, one of the ways that, in the city, when we were thinking about this work, we were looking at, as Kathy was saying, environmental justice. And we were looking at heat island effect and how the growth of the city, and especially vulnerable communities in the city, how their health effects were being impacted by the variability of how many trees you have in your community, how much radiation is the concrete absorbing, and how little is that radiation dissipating in the community. And so we did a heat mapping project where we actually partnered with a set of local universities and had students driving all around the city and measuring the temperature at 3 points during the day for an entire month. And what we saw were huge disparities in the community as far as what the heat was doing, and then tying that to medical data of how that was impacting pre-existing conditions in those communities. And then the last piece that I think was the most important was that we started to use that data for a set of community conversations that were both educating the community on what the dangers of this is. And in a place like Mississippi, we think heat is just what we have because it's always hot in Mississippi. But the number of days where the temperature was over 96 degrees has grown by over 50% in the past 10 years. And so dramatic impacts on the health outcomes of communities we're seeing because of this work. And so being willing as a city to be able to hold ourselves accountable and to bring projects forward that were about accountability, and then engaging the communities to start to create some of the interventions and having a voice in what that looks like, is really about this participatory kind of governance that I think that we need to have, and bringing the community together as a part of not just what is the problem, but actually how are we building the solutions that are going to create change in people's lives.
Yeah. And speaking of building solutions, we are, as a nation, literally facing a once in a lifetime opportunity with the availability of the funds through ARPA to get things right. So I'd love to hear your take on how you think communities can maximize the opportunities that the American Rescue Plan, infrastructure bill, et cetera, offer, especially when it comes to ensuring equity.
Sure. Well, this is the work that we're doing at the National League of Cities. And our goal is to provide the foundation for this data-informed approach to, number one, deciding what the priorities of a community are, and then to use that in order to be able to focus on the communities that need that assistance the most. As I said earlier, one of the things that I've seen over and over again is that the political process is one of influence. Who has the most influence on decision making? And influence is driven by access. And so those who have the most access have the most influence, who then have the opportunity to drive how policy is directed. And for us to use data as essentially as an equalizer to be able to, for communities to really think about what have been long-standing historical challenges, intractable challenges that have been in communities for long periods of time, and really think about how these funds can be used as a lever to create this moving in a new direction, right? What does an inflection look like in communities? And to be strategic with the money, and to be strategic about the communities that actually need that investment. So this is something that we're partnering with communities all across the country on, and helping in that thought partnership, and then also helping in the design process of the projects to really ensure that, number one, we can measure what change looks like, we can track change over time, and that we can report back on what the efficacy of these dollars are in communities. One of the things that we talked about was our goal was to return back to the administration what we called an "I told you so" document, essentially a document that talked about what it looks like when you are intentional about investing in communities, and what outcomes can you produce, and then how do we measure the impact that has in communities, and then use that as a rationale for future funding and ways that we think about future investment in communities.
Great. Anything else that anybody would like to quickly add before we get into our last question to wrap up the session?
Yeah, I'll just say a little bit about the work that the Beck Center has done recently as well on helping folks direct their investments on the American Rescue Plan. We obviously were really excited that there was such a huge emphasis on technical infrastructure in the funds coming down in this recent wave. And we hosted a series of workshops over the summer, and are going to be publishing results from those on how to use ARP funds for technical investments in rental assistance platforms, and improving the social safety net, and addressing broadband gaps, and a bunch of topics that are relevant to folks across the board. So what we found, I think, was that there are a lot of emerging kind of cooperative software solutions that are out there where governments are working together to build in-house tools, where folks are using this money to improve their internal data sharing and data governance infrastructure, which, as we know, is a huge part of technical service delivery. So I just wanted to cheer on anyone who's doing that kind of work, and also invite folks to engage with the Beck Center's work on that as well.
Great. And so to really bring this panel to kind of practical and path forward plans, I'd love to ask each of you sort of in a round robin style to share what you believe GovTech professionals should consider when making those tech investments in boosting their data. And Katya, in reading about San Jose, for example, one thing that I heard that I know our audience will definitely resonate with is the chief data officer, Christine Chung, said that not only should they be using kind of survey, census data, et cetera, but what she calls production data. And that's the data that lives in the city administration systems. And she just says this is an untapped, robust, and flexible data source. So other kind of actions for our audience.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, I was going to say, I just love that quote. And, I think agencies are sitting on that production data. They may not be utilizing it all. And as Katya said earlier, there could be simple data points and things to pull out that can have really direct action, immediate action and change. So I think, looking at your production data and really starting to analyze it, even if it's simple things, such as, permit applications over time or failed inspections in a specific area, you can really start to get some insight. And then you can layer in other data like GIS data or qualitative data. And as you start doing that, you can really start seeing, a broader and deeper analysis. And so I think, starting small with what you have, and then building it up. And then I think lastly, being able to share that data. So share it with other agencies, with other departments, with the community, so that you're really transparent and you can begin the conversation around equity and how we can advance equity initiatives.
Great. Dr. Blaine.
I would just add that I think that we don't need to underestimate our communities. We don't need to underestimate our audience. And I think that often there's the perception that the community, number one, is not interested in the data, or number two, would not be able to understand what the data is telling them. And I think that we have to understand that citizens are experts in their lived environment and their lived experience. And so when we can start to actually show by the data that validate what their lived experience is, and then use that in ways that we can think about what transformation is and include them in the process, I think that we can really build a shared understanding of the importance of data, and then a shared understanding of how that data can be used in order to be able to create solutions.
Very poignant. Katya, bring us home.
Sure, yeah. I think I would just reiterate what has already been said earlier, which is that I think the really important thing is to start from the need and work from there. I think a lot of folks, when they're looking at their production data and trying to understand what to do with it, it can seem really overwhelming, and we can start maybe working on products that just try to make use of the most data. But the actual real impact and the effect that data can have on people's lives really comes from starting backwards, or what feels like backwards, like starting with understanding what the needs are, putting in the time on the front end of big infrastructure projects to do the research and really get into the community and understand the issue that you're hoping this data will address from the ground up. Even if that means with working with other partners who can give more kind of design or research expertise. I've always found that those front end investments and understanding the real purpose and potential impact of the data go a really long way toward the sustainability of tech infrastructure investments, because it means that you know from the beginning that everything you're building has a true purpose in the community and that it will be used. So that's my biggest piece of advice.
Yeah, begin with the end in mind. Right. Thank you all very much, Katya, Kathy, and Dr. Blaine. We really, really appreciate you being here. And I know you actually appreciate the audience for focusing on this. And to the audience, on behalf of everybody, I have to say that once you start showing what you can do with the data that you do have, you're going to be very popular and you'll definitely be making a huge difference in your community. So make it part of your path forward. Thank you.